You know that story we're all told about the 20th century? The one about fascism versus communism? Well, what if that whole story is fundamentally wrong? That's the huge question at the very heart of Michael Parenti's Blackshirts and Reds. This book argues that our understanding of these ideologies isn't just history, it's an ongoing battle for how we see the world itself. So let's dive into his argument.
Parenti kicks things off by going right after what he sees as one of the most successful and misleading ideas of our time, the totalitarian twins theory. It's this belief, which you've probably heard a million times, that fascism and communism are basically just two sides of the same evil coin. He argues this isn't just some dusty historical debate, it's a really powerful story that shapes how we think today. And the rest of the book is pretty much dedicated to taking that idea apart piece by piece.
So, here's how we're going to break down his case. First, we'll look at how he goes about challenging the official story. Then we're going to dig into his big question about fascism: who did it really serve? After that, we'll get into his re-examination of communism. Then we'll explore what happened after the Cold War. And finally, we'll uncover the one key idea he uses to tie it all together: the lens of class.
All right, let's jump right in. How exactly does Parenti start to chip away at the mainstream version of 20th century history? So Parenti's goal here isn't just to give us another history lesson. It's to get us to question the story we think we already know. He wants us to step outside that official narrative and look at these three massive forces, fascism, communism, and capitalism, in a completely new way. His whole claim is that the standard version of history, the one we get in school, often buries the most important question you can ask about any political system: cui bono, a Latin phrase meaning who benefits.
Now let's get into his analysis of fascism. See, instead of getting lost in the symbols or the psychology of its leaders, Parenti asks a much more down-to-earth question. What was fascism's function? What did it actually do? And who did it work for? The answer he gives is absolutely central to his entire argument.
On the one hand, you have the common view, right, that fascism was this kind of irrational, almost insane burst of nationalist hatred. But Parenti offers a totally different take. He calls rational fascism. He argues that underneath all the chaotic, emotional stuff on the surface, there was a very cold, very logical purpose. And what was that purpose? To protect the wealth of the ownership class. We're talking factory owners, big business, major landowners, from the growing power of working people, who are starting to demand better pay and a bigger piece of the pie.
So how does Parenti say this actually went down? Well, he lays out this really clear step-by-step process. First, in places like Italy and Germany, ordinary workers and peasants were getting organized. They were winning, getting better wages, more rights, more political power. Second, all this progress started to eat into the profits of the wealthy industrialists. Third, seeing this as a threat to their bottom line, Parenti argues these elites started funding fascist groups to basically act as their muscle and violently crush these labor movements. And finally, once the fascists got into power, they did exactly that. They outlawed unions, got rid of all opposition, and basically used the full force of the state to get corporate profits booming again.
And to support this, Parenti points directly to the economic policies these fascist regimes put in place. Just look at the pattern here. What happened to labor rights? Unions and strikes were outlawed. Who benefited? Big business. What about wages? They were slashed, sometimes by as much as half. Who benefited? Big business. Government-owned industries were sold off to private companies. Who benefited? You guessed it, big business. And taxes? They were cut for the wealthy and corporations. Parenti's point is that no matter which major economic lever they pulled, the result was always the same. The wealth and power of the ownership class grew, and it grew at the direct expense of everybody else.
This quote right here really just nails Parenti's whole argument. He's saying, look, if you strip away all the flags and the rallies and the scary rhetoric, what you're left with, at the very core of fascism, is a system designed to do one thing: protect the money of the super rich from the demands of the general population.
Okay, so if that's Parenti's take on fascism, let's turn to its supposed twin, communism, and see how his analysis tries to move beyond that simple totalitarian label.
Right here, Parenti makes a really critical distinction. He asks us to separate the idea of socialism, the theory of a cooperative, classless world, from the harsh reality of what he calls siege socialism. His point is that none of these communist countries ever got to develop in a vacuum. I mean, imagine trying to build a new house while your neighbors are constantly attacking it day and night. That's the picture he paints. From day one, these states faced foreign invasions, brutal civil wars, and a crushing economic war from the most powerful countries on Earth. Parenti argues you absolutely have to understand this constant state of siege to understand why they became what they became.
authoritarian, centralized, and highly militarized.
Now, according to Parenti, even under these intense, high-pressure conditions, these states managed to do some things that are often just completely erased from the history books. He points to how they got rid of these old feudal systems, how they established guaranteed social services like a job, housing, and healthcare, and how they took these incredibly poor agrarian societies and industrialized them at a shocking speed. For hundreds of millions of people, he argues, this meant their actual material lives got a lot better than what their parents or grandparents ever knew.
But, and this is super important, Parenti's analysis isn't some kind of romantic apology. He's also brutally honest about the system's massive failures. A rigid, top-down bureaucracy that just strangled any new ideas, which led to constant shortages and inefficiency. And, maybe most critically, he is very clear about the severe suppression of political dissent and the complete lack of individual freedoms that were a defining feature of these states.
This brings us to the next big chapter in the story, the fall of communism and what Parenti argues came next.
The book paints a picture that is worlds away from all the celebrations we saw on TV in the West. Parenti details what he calls capitalist restoration, this incredibly rapid, forceful reimposition of a free market system. He argues that instead of bringing prosperity, this process actually turned many of these once industrialized second world nations into societies with third world conditions. You know, things like extreme inequality, collapsed public services, and just widespread crushing poverty.
To illustrate the human toll of these changes, the book lays out some really startling statistics. In the years right after this economic shock therapy, which is just a term for suddenly privatizing everything overnight, Parenti reports that in a place like Russia, suicide rates jumped by 50%, real incomes for regular people dropped by 40%, and the death rate for men went through the roof. This isn't just data. It points to a society in a state of massive crisis.
And if you need one single stark number to wrap your head around this economic chaos, Parenti cites reports that claimed at one point as many as 85% of the entire Russian population was pushed to or even below the poverty line. That promised prosperity? He argues it went to a tiny handful of newly created billionaires, the oligarchs. Parenti then connects all this data back to the human experience with this quote, which he says you heard all the time from ordinary people. Yeah, the problems with the old system were real, nobody denied that, but he reports that many people came to feel that the basic economic security they had once just taken for granted, things like a guaranteed job, a home, and healthcare, was suddenly gone and replaced by something much, much harsher. So this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle, the core idea that ties all of Parenti's different arguments together. How does he connect fascism, the story of communist states, and what happened after the Cold War? He does it by using one single analytical tool, the lens of class.
Okay, it is absolutely crucial to understand what Parenti means when he says class. He's not talking about how much money you have in the bank or your social status. For him, it's way more fundamental than that. It all comes down to your relationship to ownership. In any economy, do you own the things that create wealth? The factories, the land, the businesses? If you do, you're in the owner or capitalist class. Or are you in the much, much bigger group of people who don't own those things and have to sell your time and your labor to the owners just to survive? If so, you're in the working class. For Parenti, that basic economic division is the most important one in society.
So here's how this one lens ties it all together in Parenti's view. He's basically saying this fundamental class dynamic is the hidden engine driving modern history. If you look through this lens, fascism wasn't really about nationalism, it was a violent tool used to protect the owner class. Communism, for all its terrible flaws, is understood as a historic attempt to build a society without an owner class. And the fall of communism? Well, that's seen as the forceful return of that owner class to power. And that leaves us with one final big question. Blackshirts and Reds presents a very specific and, for a lot of people, a very challenging way of looking at the world. The point of this explainer isn't to convince you that he's right, but to help you understand the argument he's making. So the question the book really leaves you with is this. If you just decided to, even for a moment, look at the world through this lens of class interest, how might it change your understanding not just of the past, but of the events happening all around us right now?